Milling Through History presents The Greatest Showman. The name P.T. Barnum is certainly one that many people are well aware of. The film The Greatest Showman, starring Hugh Jackman, brought this particular performer's life into a better, more modern sense. However, there is more to P.T. Barnum than what Hugh Jackman had shown. He was born July 5th, 1810, and his grandfather, Phineas Taylor, was perhaps the greatest influence upon him. As a young man, Barnum would own several businesses, including even running a local newspaper, where he would be known as a champion for liberal causes and was ever an outspoken individual. He was so outspoken that he ended up having numerous libel lawsuits put against him. And yet, Barnum's ability to go ahead and run his mouth would eventually be the catalyst for him becoming a showman. Starting his career on June 2nd, 1835, P.T. Barnum would have his first act in the form of Joyce Heth, who he claimed was George Washington's nurse and was actually 161 years old. Upon her death, though, most people agreed Heth was really only about 80 years old. But this would only be the beginning of Barnum's success at being a showman. His first traveling show was called Barnum's Grand Scientific and Musical Theater, and this proved to be a major success. But, due to the Panic of 1837, his successful traveling show would face many financial hardships, and it would take a number of years before he could go ahead and turn things around. His luck did change in 1841 as he was able to purchase Scudder's American Museum and converted it into Barnum's American Museum, where he would showcase stuffed animals, live acts, curiosities such as giants, little people, magicians, and also have models of cities and battles. In order to bring the crowds in, he would go ahead and make the building itself the center of attention, as during the daytime he had large flags planted upon the ceiling, along with painted murals along the walls. And at night he would have lighted lamps, which would go ahead and be shown in all directions, thus bringing people to his building. In 1842, Barnum would showcase the Fiji Mermaid, which was a half monkey and half fish item of two separate creatures sewn together. While the creation of the mermaid was a hoax, Barnum justified it by saying that he made people curious, which would bring them into his building, and then he entertained them to justify the deception as a whole. In 1843, he would introduce the American public to General Tom Thumb, and because of his diminutive size and his interest in so many worldly things, this would bring about a great deal of attention. When Barnum and his troupe went on to a European tour, they would entertain Queen Victoria, who was taken with General Tom Thumb, and because of her approval, this would allow the troupe to travel throughout all of Europe and be received by many royal courts. By 1846, Barnum was so successful that annually per year, his museum was seeing 400,000 visitors. And while he was on tour in Europe, Barnum became aware of Jenny Lind, the Swedish nightingale. He offered a contract to her to come to America and tour the United States with him being her promoter. In order to successfully pull off this tour, Barnum would mortgage all of his property and would promote her tour as an influence towards bettering American morals and values. As a result, many individuals backed this particular tour, and Lind would arrive in America to a hero's welcome. As a result of the success of this tour, Barnum was able to remake all of his money and even more. Barnum would also begin to work on changing the public's perception towards theaters, which were seen at the time as dens of evil. In order to do this, he began creating shows which were specifically designed for families and would become educational. By 1856, however, the bankruptcy of the Jerome Clock Company, which Barnum had been loaning money to, would cause his own financial demise. And while many celebrated the downfall of Barnum, it was Tom Thumb, who at this point in time in his life was touring on his own, that came to the rescue of Barnum, able to go ahead and put together a European tour which would see the two become highly successful. And at the same time, Barnum would become an outspoken supporter of temperance movements. By 1860, the success of the European tour and Barnum's work as a lecturer would allow him to pay off his debts and start life over again. One of the first things Barnum did was the creation of the very first aquarium, which would bring people in to see the curiosities of the sea. With the onset of the Civil War, Barnum's museum provided a unique distraction to people who wanted to get away from the war. And Barnum was no stranger to showing off his pro-Unionist sympathies. In fact, he did it so much and so often that on July 13, 1865, a Confederate sympathizer would burn down his museum. Barnum would go ahead and reestablish the museum, only to find it being burned a second time in 1868, thus making Barnum so sad that he decided to retire from the museum industry altogether. Contrary to popular belief, though, P.T. Barnum did not get into the circus industry until he was actually 60 years old, and his show was a traveling version of all of his oddities and other features that he once housed in his museum. In 1881, his circus would merge with James Bailey to form the Barnum and Bailey Circus, which would continue to run until 2017. P.T. Barnum, though, would die from a stroke in 1891, and he would be buried in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a town in which he had worked to help build up. Ironically enough, he is buried inside of a cemetery that he himself had designed. Now be sure to click like, share, and subscribe for future episodes of Milling Through History, and be sure to leave comments below for future episode ideas, and be sure to take a look at our suggested reading page.